Hello there, I'm here in Windsor to talk to one half of a very famous couple who've spent the past 30 years at the forefront in the fight against AIDS. Together, David Furnish and Sir Elton John have raised hundreds of millions of dollars to try to help end the epidemic, but their ambition to do so by the turn of the next decade is under threat. Across the world, cases are rising, gay rights are being repealed, and the stigma that has plagued the 1980s and 1990s seems to be resurfacing. So how much hope is there of achieving that goal? Plus, what next for Sir Elton as his farewell tour comes to a close, including a headline slot at Glastonbury this weekend? We'll be discussing all of this on Beth Rigby Interviews with David Furnish. David, thank you so much for talking to us today and inviting us into your home. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd really like to get on to the work that you and your husband, Sir Elton, do and the issues you care about at the moment. But we do have to start, if you'll indulge me, with Glastonbury.
Of course.
Because Sir Elton is headlining there on Sunday. It's his last ever UK show on tour.
Yes.
Does the occasion make him nervous, or does he approach it as another day in the office?
I think this one is very special. And so it is not just another day in the office. I think when he's in the middle of his own tour and he's doing the regular shows that he always does, he's absolutely in the groove. But I think this, because it's a different set list, it's a huge outdoor live festival. He's got 4 different collaborators joining him at stage at different times, who I will not name. Sorry. So he's got a lot of changes and a lot on his plate. So I think he's anxious. Yeah, but I think good anxious, healthy anxious.
So 4 collaborators, you're not going to tell me who they are.
Sorry, I am sworn to secrecy.
Yeah, I know, and you'd have to kill me if you told me. So that would be sad for all of us.
Not with the camera crew around.
But 4 big collaborators, so it's going to be a mega show.
Four collaborators of his choosing. I mean, people he just thought, I'd really like to do something with these artists at Glastonbury.
Well, we'll all be watching, and I'm very excited for it. Now, you and Sir Elton have devoted a great part of your lives to the fight against AIDS. Yes. And now antiviral drugs means that people with HIV lead long and healthy lives. But back in the 80s, and I remember this, gay people faced terrible discrimination. And for many gay men, AIDS was a real and terrifying prospect. And progress has been hard won. When you look back, David, on that time, how scary and difficult were those days for you?
It was terrifying, because initially there wasn't even a test to find out whether you had AIDS or not. Gay men were just dying these very horrible, heavily stigmatized deaths. They were getting fired from their jobs. They were getting abandoned by their families. There were healthcare professionals who were refusing to treat them. And they were majorly stigmatized and all alone. And the prospect of that was utterly terrifying enough to keep me in the closet for all of my 20s. The prospect of coming out, and I was, dipping my toe in the water and trying to come to terms with who I was. And the prospect of dipping my toe into that was utterly, utterly terrifying. Because even after they were able to identify the virus, there were still no treatments. There was only palliative care. There was all sorts of horrible language about this is God's retribution for gay people living sinful lives. And to have all of that piled on top of you when you're dealing with an illness like AIDS, where people died very, very long, horrible, tortuous deaths. It was awful. I watched so many friends waste away. And it was heartbreaking. It was a scary time.
I mean, for younger people watching this, for you to say, in my 20s, I felt I could not come out as a gay man because of the stigma. That might surprise younger people, because it seems unconscionable now that would have been how a young person would feel.
Well, there weren't any role models in the world at that time. I was a student of business at university. There was nobody in business who was out. Everybody was, deeply in the closet. You had people like Boy George, and later on, groups like Bronski Beat and Jimmy Somerville and Frankie Goes to Hollywood, who came along. And that was fantastic, but I couldn't relate to that. That wasn't what I was doing. And when I tried to come out to my mother when I was in my early 20s, she was scared for me. She didn't reject me. She just thought, what kind of life are you going to have? You're never going to be treated fairly. You're never going to get a fair shot in life because you're going to go into, an everyday workplace and be discriminated against. And that was really daunting.
AIDS hit the headlines in the 1980s in the West, and then the global crisis focused minds at the start of the century. But do you fear now that people have moved on from this thinking that it's no longer a problem when actually it still is?
I think there are some real perceptual problems. I think because of the great success of the antiretroviral drugs, people are living long, full, healthy lives, symptom-free and side effect-free. And so the horrible face of AIDS that we saw, 20 years ago, thankfully is gone. But because of that, people are not aware of it. It's not as present in everyday lives. People who are HIV positive and taking their medication are symptom-free. You couldn't tell if they walked into a room, if you were sitting next to them. They're living full, happy lives. And so it has fallen off the radar. And we are seeing growth in new infections, particularly in parts of the world amongst young people, because young people didn't grow up with what I grew up with and what I saw. And they have no sense that they are vulnerable as well. And as a result, they're not taking the steps and the precautions that they can to protect themselves.
And David, can you give us the scale of the challenges we sit here today?
The scale of HIV globally?
The challenge we're still facing.
Well, we're dealing with marginalized communities now. We've kind of come back to where we started. In its sort of full swing, HIV/AIDS was infecting 75 million people globally. About 37 million people died. So the rest are living and are on treatment. There's a lot of undetected HIV in the world. There's certain groups and key populations that we have identified. There's the LGBTQ+ community. There's people who use drugs, and there are young people. And within those communities, we are seeing alarming rises in infections. Anywhere in the world where we've seen the criminalization of LGBT communities, we see rises in HIV infection rates because the whole disease itself becomes stigmatized, and people are therefore scared to go and get an AIDS test. If you're living in a country where it's criminalized to be gay, you're not going to go get an AIDS test, and you're certainly not going to go and pick up your medication on a regular basis because you don't want someone to think you're gay. You could get put in jail, or you could be recognized in a community where you're going to be treated shabbily and prejudiced against.
And David, if you put it in that context of some of the societal barriers in different parts of the world, you back the goal of ending the epidemic by 2030. It's just 7 years away.
Yes.
It's a noble ambition. But is it realistic given the societal complexities you're referencing?
Well, this is why we focus on the key communities. The great thing is we know where the problem lies, and the science is so good. We have the tools to affect the change that we need to affect. We can stop and create a world with no new HIV infections. We just need the funds and the resources to get into those communities and do the work that we can do within the different groups, because we've proven that in other parts of the world.
So you think you can do it? You think
we
you
do,
can do it in
and
that
the
timeframe?
UNAIDS numbers and the analysis are very, very positive. It doesn't mean there will be an end to AIDS completely, but in terms of the point where we define it as an epidemic, the level of new infections, we won't be in that area anymore. And that's a huge result if you think about it. I mean, we were going from a disease that arrived in the 80s, for which there was no hope, and within our lifetime, we think we can end it completely.
It's quite something. I mean, people remember Make Poverty History in the 2000s. That was a campaign for countries to commit to increasing foreign aid as a proportion of GDP, and the UK led its way with that.
Yep.
We're kind of backing off overseas there at the moment. Labour have no commitment to putting it back up again. You're talking about getting into marginalised communities where they need access to healthcare and support. What's your message to British politicians, to other politicians, about the need to commit resources to help people in less privileged parts of the world?
Well, within Britain, I'm quite pleased with the British government, because we launched an initiative called a Social Impact Bond, where we demonstrated to a cash-strapped NHS that by finding undetected HIV on an outpatient basis, so by making people that were having any blood work done on an outpatient basis in a hospital, we said, can we test you for HIV as well? We do this as routine. We picked up so many cases of undetected HIV in the 3 boroughs in London in which we did it. We modeled the costs saved to the NHS, and it was in the tens of millions of pounds. So the government, having seen these results, has given us an additional £20 million to go into different communities within England. Where I would like the British government to step up more is in terms of supporting the problem globally. We have the Global Fund Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which has been a great success. And at the moment, the British government has not yet made its full commitment in the way that other countries in the G7 have done. And so we're optimistic and hopeful in these difficult times that we can continue, because this is the kind of work where you can't take your foot off the accelerator, because people have to continue to have access to these medications, and they have to continue taking them in order for them to be effective. You have to take 1 pill a day in most cases for the rest of your life. So consistency is very, very important in this fight.
And David, can I turn to Ukraine now? Can you remind our viewers about your history visiting the country and your experiences there?
Well, I mean, our histories with the Ukraine is philanthropic and personal. We have supported the Ukraine because at one point in time it had the largest HIV infection rate of any country in Europe. And we partnered with some terrific people within the Ukraine and have made substantial inroads into dropping new HIV infection rates in the Ukraine by 50% and AIDS-related deaths by 80%. We've been doing that for the last 20 years. Now, well, in the midst of spending that time in the Ukraine, Alton and I were visiting an orphanage where there were children who'd been orphaned by HIV. And very famously, Alton picked up that one little boy called Lev, who really touched him. And it was a lightning strike moment. And Alton felt this compelling, overwhelming urge that he wanted to be a father at that point. And Lev had a brother. And we tried our very best to get the boys out of the country, and in the end, it was too complicated and too difficult. But we did find out that they had a grandmother who was younger and was alive and was able to look after them. She's done a wonderful job, and we're still in contact with them, and they're safe, and they're out of harm's way, which is really wonderful. But that started a longing within us, a desire within us to have a family. And adoption in this country is very, very difficult and very complicated and can take years and years. And at that point, Alton was in his 60s. And that was why we turned to surrogacy as an option to have our 2 sons of our own. And so the Ukraine is very, very emotionally connected with our family for many, many reasons.
And how worried are you about the effect the conflict with Russia, the war in Russia will have on tackling these health issues in Ukraine that you have worked so hard to deal with?
As I mentioned earlier, regular access to treatment is important. Now we have a huge migrant population, people who are being, bombed out of their homes and traveling across the country. They're being cut off from their healthcare providers. And so we've invested an additional £1.5 million and put up 44 shelters, mobile shelters, so that we can get people who are on the move and continue to keep them on their medication. Because if someone doesn't stay on their medication, their viral load drops down, their HIV becomes transmissible, and they can get sick again. So the really important thing for us, and what we've continued to do in Ukraine, is again maintain that investment and hang on to those gains that we've made and not lose them.
Before we move, I just have to say as well, Vladimir Putin is often heard about warning about the dangers of extending LGBT rights. But then it emerges that he's a great fan of Sir Elton, that the Russian health minister contacts Elton to wish him a happy birthday. Do you find it bizarre that a president that's against LGBT rights should wish to celebrate an icon of gay rights in the way that he seems to celebrate Sir Elton?
Believe me, the irony is not lost on me at all. It's a real paradox. I mean, interestingly, Putin, if you ask him, he's actually said, I'm not against gay people, I'm about protecting children. And that's the argument that a lot of people use for putting these homophobic policies in place that do damage communities and do damage LGBT lives. He professes to be a great fan. He's called Elton a musical genius and says he loves his music. On the other hand, he puts this legislation in place, and we know with this legislation, again, scared to get an AIDS test, scared to talk about it with other people, scared to pick up and access your treatment. We've also seen a huge rise in violence against LGBT people, adults within Russia, because of these laws, because it's constantly sending this message that there's something wrong, that it's not right, that it's sinful, or that it's dirty, or that it's improper. And that powers it powers hatred, and it empowers bigotry. And it is so upsetting to see this happening in different parts around the world where we feel like we've made gains.
And now you feel like you have to step up.
Absolutely.
And now advocate for for battles that you thought you had won.
Yeah, it feels like we're losing some ground. When I look at what's happening in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has put similar bills in schools in Florida, which they say are protecting children. Now they're talking about extending the ages up to, all of school, which I find such a horrible shame, because I really see what school has done for my sons. And it gives you a foundation for tolerance and acceptance within a school community. For my sons, their interaction within their peers is the most important part of their day. And to be able to talk openly and compassionately and appropriately about, the wonderful diverse world that we live in, to not have that in the school environment is a massive opportunity missed. I think it's a real, real shame.
David, you've referenced what Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, in terms of this legislation. It's a parental rights bill he's putting through in education law. It's been dubbed the Don't Say Gay bill.
Yes. The problem with the bill is that what you can and can't say is not defined. It is left completely wide open. Also in the bill is the ability for parents to sue teachers, to take legal action against them if they think they have done something inappropriate within the classroom. So with no guidelines and the threat of legal action being taken against you, teachers in Florida are terrified, scared stiff that even the simplest, most appropriate discussion of the diverse world that we live in and LGBTQ communities will end up with a huge lawsuit on their desk. And as a result, they're not talking about it at all. It's completely verboten.
How dangerous do you think he is? I mean, he's a presidential candidate.
Well, I'm horrified to see that he hasn't stopped there. He's now put laws in place in Florida which allow a doctor to discriminate against people based on their beliefs, which means a doctor can refuse to treat somebody because they're gay. Now, I find that disgusting. I find it disgusting, abhorrent, and barbaric that someone can empower a doctor, legally empower a doctor to refuse care to someone who needs it.
How frightened are you that he or Donald Trump could become the next US president?
It's a terrifying proposition, because my theory is that America is so sharply divided politically, and I don't believe the majority of Americans are extreme. I don't believe it is an extremist nation. Americans have been incredibly kind and supportive of us and our family. But there are these lapsed fringe voters and these extreme fringe voters who sort of come in and out, and they unfortunately can make the difference between making and breaking an election with a country that's so sharply divided, where literally the gap between Republicans and Democrats is a sliver. So they're enacting these policies to bring in these extra voters to get them over the line. That's my theory, and it's terrifying. And I hope for a younger generation who have grown up in a more tolerant world, where there were lots of role models, and there have been lots of people in the media, in business, in music, in films and television, that they think of gay as being absolutely fine and they don't have any issues with it at all. I hope that they go and express their outrage at the ballot box.
What do you say? Because some people watch it, and Ron DeSantis would argue that he is in tune with, as he would put it, ordinary American families worried that their children are learning about sex too early, about gender identities that they dispute. How would you respond to that argument, David?
I think he's making a lot of massive generalizations, and I think he's missing a huge opportunity, which I talked about earlier, which is to build a foundation of tolerance and understanding in schools. What I think we do need is healthy discussion with key partners and coming up with appropriate guidelines so that these discussions can take place in a school environment but in an appropriate way.
He's also introduced a ban on drug treatments or medical interventions for trans people under the age of 18 who may want puberty blockers or surgery. Do you oppose that as well, or do you think it's too complicated?
I find that the trans issue is extremely complicated, and it's very, very personal, and it's very, very much about the individual. I don't like to see any community demonized. I don't like to see any community marginalized or stigmatized. And I think, again, we need experts and we need healthy discussions about what is and what isn't appropriate within a school environment for people of all backgrounds.
Just one other thing on this. Here in the UK, and you might not want to comment on this, but here in the UK, there's also been a discussion about women's rights versus trans rights, with J.K. Rowling being called transphobic for raising those concerns. Do you think that's unfair that she gets targeted like that because she's raising concerns about another, or do you feel it's communities being pitted against each other unnecessarily?
I like to see compassion and love for all. And I have tremendous admiration for what J.K. has done with Harry Potter and how she has made so many children rediscover the joy of reading, and brought families together in a way that no one has done for a very, very long time. I don't like to see any community singled out or stigmatized. And I think when you have a platform like she has, if I was in her shoes, I would direct it towards doing what I do best, which is bringing people together through my work and through my art and my culture.
Okay, so you think take your foot off the pedal in a way?
If I was in her shoes, yes. I've only met her once. I've never had the conversation with her about it. She obviously feels quite strong about it. I don't agree. I don't approve. But that's not my decision to make. Elton, I know I live with someone as an artist who every day sees his role and his opportunity and his privilege is to bring people together through his work and through his art. Every time he goes on stage and performs, he sees it as an opportunity to bring people together, not pull them apart. And so I would choose to just stay with that.
Okay. Just one other thing on DeSantis. You clearly think that if he became president, it's going to push LGBT rights backwards quite dramatically in the US.
Absolutely. He has openly and outwardly campaigning, saying we are going to erase all left-wing social progress that has been made in this country. And his wife is turning up at rallies with a jacket saying "War on Woke" on the back of it. I think they've clearly laid those battle lines down in the ground, and the prospect of him being president is utterly horrifying.
Do you feel like you have to become, in the endeavours that you have made in your life, that you have to now engage in this war on woke, that you have to now speak up when you thought in a way that these arguments have been won?
I do, because I want to live in an AIDS-free world. Again, back to doing what you do best. I've spent 30 years working in HIV/AIDS, and when we start losing the progress that we've made with human rights and with civil rights amongst communities who are deeply affected by HIV/AIDS, I'm going to stand up and fight, because I have committed my life, as has Elton, to ending this epidemic, and we believe we can.
Can I ask you one other thing about also something that's happened recently that Sir Elton commented on, which was the Philip Schofield situation. And Sir Elton did an interview in the Radio Times, and he said it was an example of the press being extremely homophobic. Can you explain to the viewer what he's getting at there?
Okay, I think without question, Philip Schofield, and Elton agrees, behaved inappropriately. And it could be perceived as an abuse of power, and it was also, he lied about it. So he behaved inappropriately. I think what was horrifying to watch was what I would call a disproportionate response within certain levels of the media, where it was written about over and over and over, where they were piling on for days and then weeks, continually writing negative, highly critical pieces. It felt disproportionate to the situation at hand. He did an interview, he acknowledged he'd made mistakes, he wants to go forward with his life. This barrage of negative media going on and on, certain parts of the media. And I would also like to add that those same publications didn't give the same level of attention to a Prime Minister who lied and misled to Parliament, which to me is a much, much greater offence. If you weighed up the column inches that they gave to Philip Schofield on what happened with this morning and what happened with Boris Johnson recently, being banned from Parliament, you'll find a great, great difference. And that, to me, points to homophobia.
So it's something. So actually, although it's you're acknowledging that there was a power imbalance and that was problematic, but what you're saying is it was because it was two men, and if it had been a younger woman, then it wouldn't necessarily have been.
In terms of the response in the media, yes.
Okay.
I'm not saying. I want to be really clear about this. I'm not saying Philip Schofield didn't do something wrong. It was a colossal error in judgment, and then he lied about it, and he needed to step aside and resign. I think the media's response, and only certain parts of the media, was so disproportionately large and cruel and personal that, to me, it felt like homophobia, because I don't think we would have had the same response if it had been between a man and a woman.
One other thing on this is that, and the media, has been the headlines on phone hacking, several cases gone through the courts, you yourself involved in one, Prince Harry another. You've described you and Sir Elton feeling very paternal and protective towards Prince Harry. He received a lot of flack for taking the stand. He's had a difficult few years. How's he doing now?
He's fine. Harry's great. He's taken a lot of flack in the media, and you have to remember he's taking on the media. So what actually happens in the courtroom and what you read about in the newspaper are often two very, very different things. But we are in fairly regular contact, and he was very pleased the way things went in court, and he's doing really well. Okay,
well, I won't dwell on that. I'm going to go back to where we began. We've been everywhere. We've been everywhere in this interview, haven't we? Because it's the end of the tour. It's the final big concert for him on this tour in the UK. How will life change when he really stops it, just at home? Or
he'll be doing what he always does. He'll be endlessly listening to new music. He'll be getting the charts printed off and put in front of him every day, the US and the UK music charts, radio charts, download charts, and he'll be going through with his highlighter pen and looking at which records are doing well and who's on the way up and who's on the way down and which ones are British, which ones are new. Putting together content for his Apple Music radio show, which he does every week, which highlights new talent in the business. He's going to go back into the studio in October and start his next album.
Oh, wow.
Which will be great. He's not done a studio album in a long time. We've got 2 musicals we're opening next year. We've taken Tammy Faye, which we opened at the Almeida. We're going to open that in a bigger theater, and then The Devil Wears Prada, which we've been working on for 10 years. So
he's not chilling out, is he? You're not taking it easy here.
No, I don't think he'll be sitting on the sofa with a remote control, unless there's a football game on. Then that's the other thing he'll absolutely be doing. And he and the boys sit down and they watch a lot of sport together. And I let them get on with it.
It sounds like this place sounds like a good place to hang out.
It's a really good place to hang out.
Well, look, David, enjoy Glastonbury.
Thank you.
I will be looking out for you to see what you're wearing.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thanks for helping spread our message.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us at your home and being on our show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with David Furnish as much as I did. If you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to the Beth Rigby Interviews podcast. Each week I take a look at the highlights of my interview, and there's some extra bits and pieces in there too, particularly about politics. That'll be on the Sky News app or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for this week from Windsor. Thanks for watching.